They were told the Americans would execute prisoners without trial. That gunfire meant death. So when the crack of rifles echoed across the Texas camp on that autumn morning in 1945, the German women dropped to their knees. Some clutched rosaries, others pressed their faces into their hands and whispered final prayers. A few younger ones sobbed openly, certain their time had come. The sound came again, sharp, deliberate, unmistakable. Not the distant rumble of war, but close, purposeful shooting just beyond the wire. But what they expected and what was actually happening were two completely different things. The Americans were not executing anyone. They were hunting rabbits. Wild rabbits that would be cleaned, cooked, and served to the very women now praying for their lives. This was not cruelty. This was dinner. And for the German prisoners who had survived years of Nazi propaganda, the truth was more shocking than any bullet. Before we continue with this incredible story, if you appreciate these untold accounts from World War II, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. These forgotten moments of history deserve to be remembered. The women had been traveling for weeks, first by train through the shattered remains of Germany, where every kilometer revealed new devastation. They passed through cities that no longer existed, just piles of brick and twisted metal where buildings once stood. They saw German civilians living in basements and cellars, cooking over open fires in the streets, washing clothes in bomb craters filled with rainwater. Children with hollow eyes watched the train pass, their faces thin and gray. These were the people they had fought for. This was the future they had helped create. The train carried them to Bremen, where they boarded a ship bound for America. Most had never seen the ocean before. The Atlantic stretched endless and cold under gray skies. Many got seasick. They lay in the cargo hold on thin mattresses, listening to the engines rumble and the waves crash against the hull. At night, they huddled together for warmth, whispering fears and prayers into the darkness. Most were young, barely in their 20s. Some were teenagers who had been drafted into service in the final desperate months of the war. They had served in the Wehrmacht as clerks, radio operators, telephone switchboard workers, nurses, and canteen staff. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They had never fired a weapon or led troops into battle, but they wore uniforms and served the German military machine. They had typed orders, relayed messages, bandaged wounds, and served food to men who went out to kill. They had been small cogs in a vast machine of death. And now that machine had ground to a halt, leaving them scattered across the ocean, uncertain of their fate. Greta had been a telephone operator at a Luftwaffe base near Munich. She had spent 3 years sitting at a switchboard connecting calls, relaying orders. She had heard the voices of pilots before they flew their missions. She had connected calls from officers planning operations. She had never thought too deeply about what those calls meant, what those orders would result in. She had just done her job. But now, crossing the Atlantic as a prisoner, she had too much time to think, too much time to remember voices, too much time to wonder what had happened to the men on the other end of those calls. Elsa had been older, 32, a widow whose husband had died in North Africa. She had worked in a field hospital, changing bandages, emptying bedpans, holding the hands of dying boys who cried for their mothers. She had seen things that would haunt her forever. Now she sat on the ship's deck when weather permitted, staring out at the endless water, smoking cigarettes she had been given by the American guards. She said little. There was too much to say, and no words adequate to say it. During the Atlantic crossing, they had been fed regularly. Real bread, not the sawdust mixture of recent years. Real meat, not scraps or questionable substitutes. Coffee that was actually coffee, not the burnt grain and chori blend they had drunk since 1943. The first meals had been met with suspicion. Some women refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned or drugged, that this was some elaborate form of torture. Others warned that the Americans were fattening them up for some cruel purpose. But hunger is a powerful force. One by one, the women began to eat. And when nothing bad happened, when they woke each morning still alive and no one fell ill, confusion set in. The enemy was supposed to be cruel. That is what they had been told since childhood. What the propaganda had drilled into them through every radio broadcast, every newspaper, every poster on every wall. Americans were devils, subhuman, incapable of mercy. They would rape and murder prisoners. They would torture and humiliate. That was the gospel according to Goebbels, repeated so often that it had become unquestioned truth. Yet here they were being fed better than they had eaten in the last 2 years of the war. The American guards were not cruel. They were professional, even bored. They gave orders and maintained discipline, but there were no beatings, no deliberate cruelty, no sadism. The women were counted 3 times a day, assigned cleaning duties, and otherwise left alone. Some guards even smiled and made awkward jokes in broken German. It was all deeply confusing. After 2 weeks at sea, they arrived in New York. The ship sailed past the Statue of Liberty in the early morning light, and the women crowded to the railings to see it. There it stood, green and massive, holding its torch high. Liberty enlightening the world. The irony was not lost on them. They were prisoners arriving in the land of the free, and that statue welcomed everyone except them. They were transferred to another train. This one bound west and south through the American heartland. For days they traveled through landscapes unlike anything they had ever imagined. Vast fields of corn and wheat stretching to the horizon. Small towns with white churches and neat houses. Cities with tall buildings and busy streets. Everything was intact. There were no bomb craters, no burned-out buildings, no ruins. America looked exactly as it had before the war. Prosperous, confident, untouched. The train rattled through Texas in late September 1945. The heat was suffocating, unlike anything they had known in Germany. It was dry heat, the kind that sucked the moisture from your skin and left you constantly thirsty. Through the barred windows, they saw endless flat land, strange trees they did not recognize, and towns that looked like something from a Western movie. Wooden buildings with covered walkways, wide streets of packed dirt, men in cowboy hats and boots. The women pressed their faces to the windows trying to understand this alien landscape. No bombed buildings, no rubble, no starving children picking through debris. Everything looked impossibly clean and whole and normal. People went about their lives as if there had never been a war. Women hung laundry on clotheslines. Children played in yards. Men drove trucks loaded with hay or cattle. It made no sense. This was supposed to be the enemy, the nation they had been fighting. The propaganda had promised them that America was suffering, that their cities were destroyed, that their people were weak and divided and on the brink of collapse. Yet here were farms with fat cattle grazing in green pastures, houses with fresh paint and flowers in the gardens, roads without craters or damage, gas stations with fuel, stores with goods in the windows. It was the opposite of everything they had been told. America had not suffered. America had not been bombed into submission. America had fought a war on 2 fronts, thousands of miles from its own shores, and emerged stronger than ever. That was the truth. The landscape revealed, mile after mile after mile. Greta pressed her face to the window and whispered to her companion, "This cannot be real. They must be showing us only the good parts, the untouched areas. Surely there is damage somewhere." But Elsa, who was older and had seen more, shook her head slowly. "No, this is real. All of it. America was never bombed. America was never invaded. America built weapons and food and supplies, and its people were safe the whole time. We lost. This is what winning looks like." The realization settled over the women like a heavy blanket. They had lost completely. Totally. Germany lay in ruins while America thrived, and that meant everything they had been told, everything they had believed was wrong. The Reich had promised victory. The Reich had promised that Germany's enemies were weak. The Reich had lied. The train finally slowed as it approached the camp in the late afternoon. Through the dust kicked up by the wheels, they could see their destination. Rows of wooden barracks painted a neutral tan color. Guard towers at the corners, manned by soldiers with rifles, fences topped with barbed wire, enclosing several acres of flat Texas scrubland. It looked like every prison camp they had imagined, and their fear returned with full force. This was it. This was where the pretense would end. This was where the Americans would reveal their true nature. The journey, the food, the relative kindness. It had all been a trick, a way to make them compliant. Now would come the reality of captivity. The train stopped with a screech of metal on metal. American guards opened the doors and ordered them out in English and broken German. The women gathered their meager possessions, small bundles wrapped in cloth, battered suitcases held together with string, paper bags containing everything they owned. Some carried only the clothes on their backs. Others had managed to keep a photograph of their family, a letter from home, a small Bible or prayer book. These tiny possessions represented everything that connected them to their former lives. They formed a ragged line on the platform beside the train. The heat was intense. The Texas sun blazed down from a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The air shimmered over the dry ground, creating mirages in the distance. American guards stood in formation, rifles slung over shoulders, expressions unreadable behind sunglasses and under the brim of their hats. They looked calm, professional, not particularly interested in the exhausted women standing before them. That was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. Anger you could understand. This indifference suggested they were not even worth hating. A female officer stepped forward from the line of guards. She was young, maybe 30, with brown hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore the same uniform as the men, but somehow made it look crisp despite the heat. She spoke in German, her accent strange, American vowels trying to wrap themselves around German consonants, but understandable. You will be processed, assigned quarters, and given work duties. You will follow camp rules at all times. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Do you understand? The women nodded silently, a few murmuring yes or jaw. What else could they do? The officer looked them over, her expression softening slightly as she took in their exhaustion, their fear, their barely contained desperation. You will also be fed, clothed, and given medical care as needed. She continued, You are prisoners of war, but you are also human beings under international law. We will treat you as such. Remember that. Follow the rules, do your work, and you will be fine. Do you understand? Again, the nods. Again, the murmured responses. Greta exchanged a glance with Elsa, who stood beside her in the line. Human beings. The words felt foreign, almost absurd. In the last years of the war, they had been numbers, uniform numbers, ration card numbers, identity numbers stamped on papers and recorded in ledgers. They had been replaceable parts in a military machine, used up and discarded when no longer needed. The Reich had called them soldiers, servants of the fatherland, members of the Aryan race. But human beings? That simple phrase felt more radical than any propaganda they had heard. Now the enemy was calling them human beings, not German or Nazi or prisoner, just human beings. It made no sense. Nothing made sense anymore. But they would learn in the days and weeks to come that the Americans meant it. For better or worse, incomprehensibly, they meant it. Processing took hours. The women stood in lines that snaked through a series of administrative buildings. Each station bringing a new form to fill, a new question to answer, a new American official with a clipboard and a bored expression. They gave their names, ranks, units. They answered questions about where they had served, what they had done, whether they had any special skills. The interrogations were not harsh. No one shouted or threatened, but they were thorough and exhausting. Greta found herself sitting across a desk from a middle-aged American woman in uniform who spoke perfect German. Name? The woman asked. Greta Hoffman. Age? 23. Rank and position? Luftwaffe and Hellerin? Telephone operator? The woman wrote everything down in neat handwriting. Any family? Mother in Hamburg, father dead, one brother missing. The woman looked up at that, her expression softening briefly. I'm sorry, she said, and it sounded genuine. Then she returned to her form. Any medical conditions I should know about? The questions continued for what felt like forever. Then Greta was sent to a medical examination. A doctor, another American, looked her over with clinical efficiency. He checked her eyes, her throat, her teeth. He listened to her heart and lungs. He examined her hands and arms. He asked about injuries or illnesses. Through an interpreter, he told her she was malnourished, but otherwise healthy. "We'll get some weight on you," he said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. 2 weeks of regular meals, and you'll feel better. Some women were found to have lice and were immediately sent to the dowsing station. Others showed signs of more serious malnutrition, protruding ribs, hollow cheeks, brittle hair, and were marked for extra rations and medical monitoring. A few had untreated injuries from the chaos of the war's end. Badly set broken bones, infected wounds that had never been properly cleaned, scars from shrapnel or debris. The Americans documented everything meticulously. They were efficient, almost mechanical in their procedures. There were no insults, no beatings, no deliberate degradation, just paperwork and routine, forms and stamps and records filed away in folders. The dowsing station terrified those who were sent there. Rumors had circulated during the war about gas chambers disguised as showers. When Greta and 15 other women were herded into a tiled room and told to undress, panic seized them. This was it. This was how it would end. Some began to cry. Others stood frozen, unable to move. But then a female attendant entered, speaking calmly in German. "You will shower. You will be given soap and clean clothes. That is all. No one will harm you." She demonstrated by turning on the water. Hot water streamed from the shower heads, filling the room with steam. She held out a bar of white soap. "See? Just soap. Just water. You are safe." Slowly, hesitantly, the women undressed. They stepped under the water. And for the first time in months, they felt clean. The hot water washed away layers of grime, fear, and exhaustion. Some women wept openly, overwhelmed by the simple act of being clean. Greta stood under the stream, eyes closed, and tried to remember the last time she had felt hot water. It had been before the bombing started, before the food ran out, before everything fell apart. After the showers, they were given clean clothes, not uniforms, but simple cotton dresses and undergarments. The clothes were worn, but clean, likely donated or salvaged from somewhere. Greta looked down at her dress and felt strange. She had worn a uniform for 3 years. The dress made her feel like a person again, not a soldier, not a number, just a person. Then came the first meal. They were led to a mess hall, a long wooden building with rows of tables and benches. The smell hit them first. Bread. Fresh bread. Not the sawdust mixture they had eaten in Germany, but real bread made with wheat and something else. Meat. Roasting meat. The scent was overwhelming. Several women stopped in the doorway, unable to believe what they were smelling. They filed past a serving line. American cooks, most of them young men in white aprons, scooped food onto metal trays. Mashed potatoes, green beans, sliced bread with butter, and meat. Actual meat. Not scraps or gristle, but real pieces of roasted chicken. Greta stared at her tray as if it might vanish. Beside her, Elsa whispered, "This cannot be for us. There must be a mistake." But there was no mistake. They sat at the long tables and ate in silence. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite. Others ate quickly, as if afraid the food would be taken away. A few could not eat at all, their stomachs too shrunken from years of deprivation. They just stared at their trays, tears streaming down their faces. Greta forced herself to eat slowly. The chicken was tender and seasoned with herbs she did not recognize. The potatoes were smooth and creamy. The bread was soft and still warm. She thought of her mother back in Hamburg, living in the basement of their bombed house, eating watery soup made from turnips and grass. She thought of her younger brother missing in action on the Eastern Front. And here she was, a prisoner of war, eating better than she had in 3 years. The guilt was immediate and crushing. How could she eat this food while her family starved? How could she sit here safe and fed while Germany lay in ruins? She put down her fork, unable to continue beside her. Elsa was crying softly. "My children," she whispered. "My children are hungry, and I am here eating chicken." An American soldier walked past, a young man with red hair and freckles. He glanced at their table and gave a small awkward smile. Not mocking, not cruel, just human. Just a boy who probably had a mother and sister somewhere. Greta looked away, unable to process the kindness in that simple gesture. After the meal, they were assigned to barracks. The buildings were simple but clean. Each woman received a cot with a thin mattress, a pillow, and 2 blankets. The barracks had electricity and running water. There were toilets and sinks. It was nothing luxurious, but compared to the bombed-out buildings and cold cellars of Germany, it felt like a palace. That first night, Greta lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling. Around her, women whispered to each other in the darkness. Some prayed, some cried quietly, some just lay in silence, processing everything that had happened. Outside, crickets chirped in the warm Texas night. There were no air raid. Sirens, no bombs, no sound of distant artillery, just crickets and the soft murmur of voices. Greta pulled out a small notebook she had managed to keep hidden during the journey. She had been writing in it since the last days of the war, recording her thoughts when she could find a pencil. Now, by the dim light from the window, she wrote, "We have been fed. We have been given beds. The Americans do not beat us or mock us. I do not understand this. Everything we were told was a lie. But if that was a lie, what else was false? What did we fight for? What did we believe?" She closed the notebook and lay back down. Sleep would not come easily. Her mind was too full of questions, and her heart was too heavy with guilt. Outside, an American guard walked past the barracks on his rounds. His footsteps were steady and unhurried, not the boots of a conqueror, just the footsteps of a man doing his job. And somehow that made everything more confusing. The days developed a rhythm that was both comforting and disorienting. Wake at dawn when a bell rang across the compound, its sound echoing off the wooden barracks. Wash faces and brush teeth at the communal sinks. Real toothbrushes and toothpaste provided by the Americans. Dress in the cotton work clothes they had been issued. Line up for breakfast in the mess hall. The routine was simple, predictable, almost peaceful. It felt wrong to feel peaceful when everything you loved had been destroyed. But the human body and mind craved routine. Crave normally even in captivity. Work assignments came after breakfast. Some women worked in the camp kitchen, helping prepare meals for hundreds of prisoners and guards. Others did laundry, hauling heavy wet sheets and uniforms to hang on lines that stretched across an open field. A few with medical training worked in the infirmary, assisting the American doctor with sick call and minor injuries. Some were assigned to maintenance crews, cleaning barracks, sweeping walkways, pulling weeds from around the buildings. A select group was taken by truck to nearby farms to pick cotton or vegetables under armed guard, working alongside local civilian laborers and even German PS from other camps. Greta was assigned to the kitchen, and it changed everything she thought she knew. She spent her days peeling mountains of potatoes, washing dishes in huge metal sinks, helping prepare meals that would feed hundreds of people. The American cooks treated her with casual indifference that felt almost respectful. They gave her tasks, showed her how they wanted things done, and left her to work. There were no insults, no cruelty, no deliberate humiliation designed to break her spirit. She was just another worker, another set of hands in a busy kitchen. The head cook, a large man named Sergeant Martinez from somewhere called New Mexico, even thanked her at the end of each shift. "Good work today, Greta," he would say, in his heavily accented German. The simple courtesy bewildered her. But what shocked Greta most was the abundance. The kitchen had food, real food in quantities that seemed impossible. Sacks of flour stacked to the ceiling, crates of potatoes, entire sides of beef hanging in the cold room, more meat than her family would have seen in a year, jars of pickles and preserves, canned goods filling entire shelves, vegetables, fruits, soups, all labeled in English, sugar in bags that weighed as much as a small child, salt in quantities that made no sense when Germany had been grinding up rocks for seasoning. Spices she had not seen since before the war: pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, vanilla. The Americans used all of it freely, generously, almost wastefully. They cooked 3 full meals a day for everyone in the camp, prisoners and guards alike, the same food, the same portions. There was no rationing, no carefully measured spoonfuls, no making do with substitutes and scraps. They simply had enough. More than enough. They had abundance. And it showed in every meal that came out of that kitchen. Breakfast, eggs, bacon, toast, oatmeal, fruit, coffee, lunch, soup, sandwiches, vegetables. Dinner, meat, potatoes, bread, vegetables, often dessert, every single day, without fail. as if food were infinite and always would be. One day, Greta watched Sergeant Martinez throw away half a loaf of bread because it had gone stale. She stood frozen at the sink, hands in soapy water, unable to believe what she had just seen. He noticed her staring and shrugged, a gesture that seemed to encompass his entire philosophy. "Can't serve stale bread?" he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, as if there were no other possible consideration. Then he tossed it into a garbage bin that was already half full of food scraps, and went back to work. Greta looked into that garbage bin and saw more food than her family would find in a week. She thought of her mother back in Hamburg, living in the basement of their bombed house, eating watery soup made from turnips and grass, and whatever else could be scavenged. She thought of children she had seen on the train journey through Germany, picking through rubble and trash heaps for anything edible. And here, in the enemy's camp, they threw away food because it was stale. The contrast was so vast, so incomprehensible that it made her physically dizzy. She had to grip the edge of the sink to steady herself. The contradiction gnawed at Greta constantly, a persistent ache she could not escape. How could the enemy have so much while her homeland had nothing? The propaganda had said America was weak, that the war was bleeding them dry, that their society was collapsing under the strain of fighting on two fronts. But everything she saw proved the opposite. America was strong. America was wealthy. America had fought a global war while maintaining this level of abundance at home. America had won the war decisively, overwhelmingly, and it showed in every meal, every clean uniform, every well-maintained building, every piece of equipment that worked perfectly, every casual gesture of waste that would have been a month's rations in Germany. The women were also paid for their work, which seemed bizarre and wrong in equal measure. Not much, just a few dollars a month in camp script that could only be used at the canteen. But it was payment nonetheless. Prisoners being paid to work, enemies compensated for their labor. The concept was alien to women who had been raised in a system where work was duty, sacrifice was obligation, and everything was for the state. In Germany, you worked because the Reich demanded it, because the Führer commanded it, because anything less was treason. But here, even prisoners received wages. Even enemies were entitled to compensation for their labor. The canteen became a source of wonder and guilt. It was a small building with shelves stocked with items the women could buy. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, soap, toothpaste, writing paper, pencils, even lipstick. Greta stood in front of the chocolate display for 10 minutes the first time she entered, unable to decide if she should buy one. It felt wrong. It felt like a betrayal. Her family was starving, and she was buying chocolate, but she bought it anyway. That night, she broke the bar into small pieces and shared it with the women in her barrack. They ate it slowly, reverently, trying to make it last. Some cried, some laughed, some just sat in silence, overwhelmed by the simple sweetness. Elsa whispered, "I cannot remember the last time I tasted chocolate. Before the war. I think before the war." Letters from home began to arrive, filtered through military censors but mostly intact. The news was devastating. Germany was in ruins. Cities were destroyed. Millions were homeless. Food was scarce. The occupation forces controlled everything. Families were living in cellars and bombed-out buildings. Greta received a letter from her mother written on a torn piece of paper in shaky handwriting. "We are alive, but barely. Your father is ill. We have no medicine. We eat what we can find. The neighbor's daughter died last week from hunger. Please, if you have anything, send it. We are desperate." Greta read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it under her pillow. That night at dinner, she stared at her plate. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread, butter, and a slice of apple pie for dessert. Her mother was starving and she was being served pie. The Americans gave her pie while her mother ate garbage. The injustice of it burned in her chest. But it was not really injustice, was it? It was war. It was consequence. Germany had started the war. Germany had lost. This was what defeat looked like. The winners ate pie. The losers starved. That was the brutal truth of it. but knowing that did not make the guilt any easier to bear. The women discussed it endlessly in the barracks at night. How could they reconcile their own survival with their family's suffering? How could they accept kindness from the enemy while their loved ones suffered under occupation? Some argued that they should refuse the food, refuse the comfort, refuse everything as a form of resistance. But that seemed pointless. Their refusal would not help anyone back home. It would only add more suffering to the world. Others argued that they should be grateful. They were alive. They were safe. They were being treated far better than German prisoners had been treated by Germany. Perhaps this was mercy. Perhaps this was what civilization looked like. Perhaps the Americans were showing them what Germany had forgotten. The guards themselves were a puzzle. Most were young, barely older than the prisoners. Some had fought in Europe and seen the concentration camps. Their eyes held a hardness that never quite went away. But even they did not abuse the women. They kept their distance, did their jobs, and treated the prisoners with professional detachment. A few were friendly, offering cigarettes or helping with heavy work. Others were cold, but never cruel. One guard, a sergeant named William, spoke some German. He sometimes stopped to chat with the women during their outdoor recreation time. He asked about Germany, about their families, about what they did before the war. The conversations were awkward at first. He was the enemy. They were prisoners. But slowly they became almost normal. He told them about his farm in Iowa. They told him about their homes in Hamburg, Munich, Berlin. Once he showed them a photograph of his wife and baby daughter. "That's why I'm here," he said simply. "To make sure they grow up in a world without another war." Greta looked at the photograph and saw a woman who could have been her sister. The baby could have been her niece. The guard could have been her cousin. If geography and politics had been different, they could have been neighbors. Instead, they were enemy and prisoner. The women's bodies changed after weeks of regular food. Their faces filled out. Their hair grew back thicker. Their skin cleared. They gained weight. Some looked in the mirror and barely recognized themselves. They looked healthy. They looked almost normal. And that felt like another betrayal. How could they look healthy while their families wasted away? Greta wrote in her diary almost every night now. The words poured out questions and observations and guilt. "I am becoming fat while mother starves. I sleep in a bed while father coughs in a cold cellar. I eat meat while children beg in the streets. What kind of daughter am I? What kind of person? The Americans feed me not from kindness, but from duty. The Geneva Convention requires it. But still, they feed me. They clothe me. They keep me safe. And I hate them for it because it would be easier if they were cruel. Cruelty I could understand. This kindness breaks something inside me." It happened on a Tuesday morning in late October. The Texas autumn had brought cooler air, a blessed relief after the brutal summer heat that had felt like being slowly baked alive. The women were in their barracks during free time after breakfast. Some were writing letters home, carefully composing words that would pass through military censorship. Others were mending clothes, darning socks, sewing buttons back onto worn dresses. A few sat in small groups talking quietly, while some just rested on their bunks, staring at the ceiling or at photographs of family members they might never see again. The autumn air drifted through the open windows, carrying the smell of dry grass and dust, reminding some of harvest time back home, back when home still existed. Through the open windows, they could hear the ordinary sounds of the camp: guards calling to each other, a truck engine rumbling somewhere, birds chirping in the scrubby trees that dotted the compound. It was peaceful, almost normal. Greta sat at a small table near a window, pen in hand, struggling to write a letter to her mother. What could she say? That she was well fed and safe while her mother starved in the ruins of Hamburg? That the Americans were kind while Germany lay crushed under occupation? That she missed home but feared returning to it? Every sentence she started seemed wrong, inadequate, even dangerous if it revealed too much truth about conditions here. Then came the first shot, a sharp crack that split the morning air, echoing across the compound with terrifying clarity. The sound seemed to come from just beyond the fence, maybe 100 yards away, maybe less. Every woman in the barrack froze instantly. Greta's pen stopped midward, leaving a small ink blot on the paper. Elsa dropped the sock she was darning, the needle rolling across the floor. Across the room, a young woman named Hilda let out a small gasp. The air itself seemed to stop moving. Time suspended, breath caught. In that endless second between the shot and its meaning, they all knew. They all understood this was it. Then came the second shot and the third. Sharp, deliberate, unmistakable. Not the distant rumble of artillery or the scattered pop of training fire. These were close. These were purposeful. These were the sounds of execution. The propaganda rushed back with overwhelming force. Americans execute prisoners. They line them up and shoot them. They do it systematically, coldly, efficiently. This was the truth hidden beneath the meals and the soap. This was the reality they had always known would come. They had been lulled into thinking they were safe. But now the illusion was shattering with each crack of gunfire. "They are executing someone," Hilda whispered, her voice shaking barely above a breath. "They are shooting prisoners. Oh God, they are killing us." The panic spread through the barrack like wildfire, instant and consuming. Women dropped to their knees. Some crawled under their bunks, pressing themselves against the wooden floor as if it could protect them. Others huddled together in corners, holding each other, rocking back and forth. The youngest among them, a girl named Annalisa, who was barely 19 and looked even younger, began to sob uncontrollably, her whole body shaking with terror. More shots rang out. 5, 6, 7, in quick succession, each one like a physical blow. Greta felt her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. Her hands were shaking. Her mouth was dry. This was it. This was what they had been waiting for. The Americans had been playing a long game, fattening them up like livestock, making them comfortable, making them believe they might be safe. And now came the reality. They would be taken out in groups and shot. That was how it always ended. That was how it had to end. The strong did not show mercy to the weak. The victors did not spare the vanquished. That was the law of nature, the law of war, the law of everything. "Pray," someone said, though Greta could not see who through her own terror and the press of bodies. "We must pray. We must make peace with God." And they did. The Catholic women pulled out rosaries they had hidden in their pockets, or sewn into hems and clutched them with white knuckles, whispering Hail Marys in rapid German, the words running together in desperate rhythm. The Protestants recited the Lord's Prayer, some in German, some in the old Lutheran German, that their grandmothers had taught them. Even those who had lost their faith in the trenches and the bombings, who had seen too much death and suffering to believe in a merciful God, found themselves whispering desperate pleas to a deity they were no longer sure existed. "Forgive us. Save us. Watch over those we leave behind." Greta pressed her hands together and closed her eyes, her whole body trembling. "Forgive me," she whispered in German. "Forgive me for everything I did and everything I failed to do. Watch over my mother and father. Tell them I loved them. Tell them I tried to be good. Tell them I am sorry I could not save them or help them. Tell them." Her voice broke. She could not continue. Around her, other women were making their own peace, whispering their own final prayers, saying goodbye to families they would never see again, asking forgiveness for sins real and imagined. The shooting continued, not constant, but sporadic. A few shots, then silence that stretched for unbearable seconds, then more shots. The pattern was irregular, unpredictable, which somehow made it worse. Each pause brought a moment of desperate hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe they had been spared, only to have that hope crushed by the next volley. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. Time had lost all meaning. There was only the waiting, the terror, the certainty of death approaching step by step, shot by shot. The women remained frozen in their positions of fear and prayer, waiting for the inevitable, waiting for the guards to burst through the door, rifles ready to line them up and march them out to their deaths, waiting for their names to be called, waiting for the order to stand, to walk, to face the guns. They had all imagined this moment in various ways during the long journey to America, during the quiet nights in the barracks when sleep would not come. Now it was here, and it was somehow both exactly as they had feared and worse, because the waiting was endless, because the not knowing was its own special torture. But no guards came. The shooting eventually stopped, the last echo fading across the compound. Silence fell over the camp again, broken only by the sound of women crying softly, by the ragged breathing of those who had been holding their breath, by a whispered prayer still continuing even after the guns had gone quiet. They waited. Seconds became minutes. Minutes stretched. Still nothing happened. No orders. No boots on the wooden steps outside. No harsh commands in English. No rifle butts pounding on doors. Just silence and the slow creeping confusion of continued survival. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of waiting for death that refused to come, they heard voices outside. American voices speaking. Casually, even laughing. Laughing. The sound was so incongruous, so impossible after what they had just heard, that several women looked up in confusion. How could anyone laugh after an execution? What kind of monsters laughed while bodies still lay warm? Greta, still shaking but driven by a need to understand, crept slowly to the window and peered out carefully, afraid of what she might see. Bodies, blood, guards dragging corpses away. What she saw made absolutely no sense. 3 American soldiers were walking casually toward the camp gate, rifles slung over their shoulders in the relaxed way of men who had just finished some routine task. They were talking to each other, smiling, completely at ease. And in their hands, dangling by their hind legs, were dead rabbits. 5 or 6 cottontail rabbits, brown and white, clearly freshly killed, blood still dripping from their noses. The soldiers looked pleased with themselves, satisfied, like hunters returning from a successful morning in the field. Because that is exactly what they were. Greta stared, her mind unable to process what her eyes were seeing. The two realities, what she had thought was happening and what had actually been happening, could not reconcile. Behind her, other women were coming to the windows now, drawn by her silence, by the need to understand what was happening. "What is it?" Elsa asked, her voice from crying. "What are they doing? Where are the bodies?" Greta could only point with a shaking hand that still trembled with adrenaline and terror and confusion. "Rabbits!" she said, and her voice sounded strange, even to her own ears, distant and hollow. They were hunting rabbits. The women crowded to the windows, now looking out in disbelief. One of the soldiers noticed them watching and gave a cheerful wave. "Dinner!" he called out in English, holding up the rabbits. "Fresh meat tonight." Then he and his companions walked toward the kitchen, still talking and joking among themselves. The women stood in stunned silence. They had been praying for their lives. They had been certain they were about to die. And all along the Americans were just hunting rabbits for dinner. Not executing prisoners, not punishing anyone, just hunting rabbits for food. Food that would be cooked and served to everyone, including the prisoners. Greta sat down heavily on her bunk. Her hands were still shaking around her. Women were reacting in different ways. Some laughed almost hysterically, relieved and embarrassed. Some cried harder, overwhelmed by the fear they had just experienced. Some just sat in silence, processing what had happened. Hilda said what many were thinking. We are so broken that we hear hunting and think of execution. What have we become? That evening at dinner, they were served rabbit stew. The same rabbits that had caused such terror now sat in bowls before them, cooked in a rich broth with carrots, potatoes, and herbs. The meat was tender and flavorful. It was delicious, and that somehow made it worse. They had feared for their lives, and the Americans had been preparing them a good meal. The contrast was almost unbearable. Greta ate her stew in silence, each bite a reminder of how completely their expectations had been shattered. Everything they had been taught, everything they had believed was proving false. The Americans were not monsters. They were not cruel. They were just people. People who hunted rabbits and made stew and treated prisoners like human beings. And that realization was more devastating than any punishment. After dinner, Sergeant Williams approached their table. "I heard you ladies got scared this morning," he said in his careful German. "The shooting? I'm sorry about that. We should have warned you. We just wanted to get some fresh meat for dinner. There's rabbits all over the place out here." He paused, seeing their faces. You thought we were executing people?" "No, no, ma'am. We don't do that. That's not how we operate. He looked genuinely distressed that they had been frightened. "I'll make sure the camp commander puts out a notice. If we're going hunting, we'll let you know first. You shouldn't have to be afraid like that." "That's not right." Then he nodded awkwardly and walked away, leaving the women staring after him in confusion. That night, Greta wrote in her diary with shaking hands, "Today, I was certain I would die. I prayed to God and said goodbye to my family. I prepared myself for the end. And then I learned that the Americans were hunting rabbits. Rabbits for food for us. They hunt wild animals to give us fresh meat. And I thought they were executing us. What does that say about them? What does it say about us? What does it say about everything we believed? I am alive. I am safe. And I'm more confused than ever." The incident with the rabbits became a turning point. In the days and weeks that followed, something changed among the women. It was subtle at first, easy to miss, but profound. The fear that had defined their existence began to fade. Not completely. They were still prisoners in a foreign land, still separated from their families, still uncertain of their future. But the immediate visceral terror of death began to recede. They began to see the camp and the Americans with different eyes. The guards were just men doing a job. Young men mostly who wanted to go home to their families. Some were kind, some were indifferent, some were still angry about the war, but none were the monsters from the propaganda. They were human with all the complexity that implied. The women started to talk more openly among themselves. Late at night in the barracks, they would discuss the war, the propaganda, the lies they had been told. It was dangerous territory. Even here, even as prisoners, there was a fear of speaking too freely. But slowly, carefully, they began to acknowledge the truth. Germany had been wrong. The Reich had lied. Everything they had believed was built on falsehood and hate. One woman, a former teacher named Margaret, said it plainly one night. "We were told that Jews were subhuman, that Slavs were inferior, that Americans were weak. We were told that we were the master race destined to rule. And we believed it, or at least we did not question it enough. And now we see the result. Our cities are destroyed. Our families starve. Our country is divided and occupied. And the people we called inferior are feeding us and treating us with more dignity than our own leaders ever did." The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, Ilse spoke. "If we were wrong about them, what else were we wrong about? Everything. Was anything we believed true?" No one had an answer. The foundations of their worldview had crumbled, and they were left standing in the ruins, trying to figure out what to build next. Greta found herself watching the American soldiers more carefully now. She noticed how they treated each other. There was a black soldier who worked in the motor pool, and she saw white soldiers talking with him as an equal, joking with him, sharing cigarettes. In Germany, she had been taught that races should not mix, that some were superior to others. But here, she saw men of different colors working together, eating together, treating each other with basic human respect. It was not perfect. She could see the tensions and inequalities even in the American system. But it was so different from what she had been taught that it forced her to question everything. The hardest part was not the realization that the enemy was human. The hardest part was the realization of what that meant about her own country, her own choices, her own complicity. She had worn the uniform. She had done her job. She had supported the war effort. And even if she had not pulled a trigger or given orders, she had been part of it. They all had. And that guilt was harder to bear than any punishment the Americans could devise. Letters from home continued to arrive, each one more desperate than the last. The contrast between their situation and their family's suffering grew more painful with each passing week. Greta received word that her father had died. Illness, her mother wrote, but really it was hunger and cold and the slow grinding down of hope. She read the letter 3 times, then walked to the edge of the camp and stared out at the Texas landscape through the fence. Her father was dead, and she had not been there. She had been here safe and fed, eating rabbit stew and sleeping in a bed with clean sheets. The guilt threatened to crush her. Sergeant Williams found her there an hour later, still standing at the fence. "Bad news?" he asked gently. She nodded, unable to speak. He stood beside her for a moment in silence, then said, "I'm sorry for your loss." That was all. Just those simple words. And then he left her alone with her grief. The kindness of that moment stayed with her. He did not have to stop. He did not have to say anything. She was a prisoner, an enemy, part of a nation that had caused immense suffering. But he had seen her pain, and acknowledged it. That simple human gesture cut through all the propaganda and politics and reached something fundamental. Suffering was suffering. Grief was grief. No matter what uniform you wore, or what flag you served. As autumn turned to winter, the camp settled into a new normal. The women knew they would eventually be repatriated, sent back to Germany. But for now, they were here. And here, despite being prisoners, despite the guilt and confusion and pain, they were safe. They were alive. And slowly, reluctantly, they began to accept that survival was not a betrayal of their families, but a gift they could honor by learning from it. Winter in Texas was mild compared to German winters, but it still brought cold nights and gray days. The women were issued warmer clothes, jackets, and sweaters donated by American churches and relief organizations. Each piece of clothing was a reminder of the vast gulf between the two nations. Americans had so much they could give away what Germans desperately needed. Christmas came, and the Americans organized a small celebration. There was a tree decorated with handmade ornaments. The mess hall served a special meal with turkey and stuffing. Some of the guards sang carols, and a few of the women joined in, their voices blending in songs they had all learned as children. For a brief moment, the war felt distant, and they were just people sharing a holiday. But then the moment passed, and reality returned. The women were prisoners. Their homeland was occupied. Their families were suffering. No amount of turkey or Christmas carols could change that. Yet something had shifted. They were beginning to see a future beyond the war. Not a future in which everything would be fixed or forgiven, but a future in which life could continue. That was something. In January 1946, word came that they would begin repatriation in the spring. The women had mixed feelings. They wanted to go home, wanted to see their families, wanted to help rebuild. But they also feared what they would find. Germany was in ruins, occupied by 4 different powers, divided and defeated. What kind of life awaited them there? And how would their families react to them returning healthy and well-fed when everyone else had suffered? Greta wrote in her diary, "We are going home soon. Home. But what is home now? The house I grew up in is destroyed. My father is dead. My mother lives in a cellar. The streets I walked as a child are piles of rubble. The country I knew no longer exists. What am I going home to? And what will I tell them about this place? Will they believe me if I say the Americans treated us with dignity? Will they understand that the enemy showed us more mercy than our own government did? Or will they see me as a traitor for acknowledging it?" The last weeks in the camp were bittersweet. The women began preparing for the journey home, sorting their few possessions, writing final letters, saying goodbye to the place that had been their prison and sanctuary. Some of the guards they had come to know would wish them well. Others maintained professional distance to the end. But there was an acknowledgement, unspoken but real, that they had all been through something significant together. On one of the last days, Sergeant Williams gathered a group of women who were preparing to leave. He spoke in his careful German, choosing words deliberately. "You are going home to a difficult situation. Your country has been through terrible things, some of which you witnessed, some of which you caused. I cannot tell you how to live with that. But I can tell you this. You are not your government. You are not your leaders' choices. You are individuals with the capacity to make your own decisions now. What you do next matters. How you rebuild matters. What you teach your children matters. The war is over. But the peace is just beginning, and it is up to all of us to make it work." The women listened in silence. Some nodded. Some looked away. But all heard the message. They had been given a second chance. Not through their own merit, but through the grace of mercy they did not deserve. What they did with that chance would define the rest of their lives. Years later, Greta would tell her daughter about the day she heard gunshots and thought she was going to die. She would describe the terror, the prayers, the absolute certainty that the end had come. And then the reveal. They were hunting rabbits. Rabbits to feed us. Her daughter, born in the New Germany, would struggle to understand. How could you think they would execute you? They were Americans. They followed laws. They had the Geneva Convention. And Greta would try to explain what it was like to live in a world of propaganda so complete that up became down and wrong became right. She would try to describe how fear could rewire your mind, how lies repeated often enough became indistinguishable from truth, how easy it was to believe the worst about those you were told to hate. She would tell her daughter that the rabbits were not just rabbits. They were proof that everything she had been taught was wrong. They were proof that the enemy was more human than the leaders who had sent her to war. But most importantly, she would tell her daughter this: the Americans did not have to hunt rabbits for us. They could have given us minimal rations, kept us locked up, treated us as the enemy we were. But they chose to do more. They chose to see us as people. And that choice, that small act of hunting rabbits for fresh meat, taught me more about civilization than all the propaganda ever did. Kindness is not weakness. Mercy is not naive. Treating others with dignity, even when they do not deserve it, is the hardest and most important thing humans can do. The gunshots that day were not the sound of execution. They were the sound of life continuing, of soldiers doing normal tasks in normal ways, of a nation powerful enough to show mercy. And for the women who heard them, they became the sound of everything changing. The moment when fear began to give way to understanding, when hate began to give way to hope, when prisoners began to see the possibility of becoming people again. That is the story worth remembering. Not just the history of war and suffering, but the small moments of unexpected humanity that showed a different path forward. The rabbits, the soup, the simple acknowledgement that even enemies deserve to be fed. These are the moments that rebuilt the world after the war. These are the lessons we still need today. If this story moved you or taught you something about this overlooked chapter of history, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. There are so many untold stories from World War II that deserve to be preserved and shared. By subscribing, you help us continue bringing these important historical accounts to light. Thank you for